Welcome back to the program. Joining me here in the studio is regular political panellist, Labor Senator Matt Thistlethwaite. Thanks for joining us, Matt. And from Melbourne, Liberal Party member for Kooyong and up-and-comer Josh Frydenberg. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Matt.
Look, I'll come to you first, Josh. I want to get both of your reaction to the comments from Nick Greiner today, the former New South Wales Premier, a person who's been given a job by Julia Gillard to look at taxation reform or GST spending in Australia. He says the GST needs reform. We should look at broadening the base of the tax and maybe increasing the rate. Would a Tony Abbott government do that, Josh Frydenberg?
Absolutely not. We're not about to touch the GST. Although it was introduced by the Howard government, I think it's a very effective tax in terms of being a consumption tax as opposed to an income tax.
But if you're serious about any sort of economic reform, any sort of taxation reform, you have to look at the GST.
No, the tax reform that we're focused on is the carbon tax and the mining tax, Chris, and that's going to be a huge benefit to the economy if we can get rid of those two taxes because they are a disincentive to investment. But it's worth reminding the Labor Party, Chris, that when they opposed the GST, as a result of the negotiations we had to undertake with the Democrats, fresh food was taken out of the GST. Now you've got Labor state governments wanting more and more of that GST.
So you want food back in, Josh?
Well, I'm just saying it was a compromise to start with, and that goes back to the Howard negotiations. But look,
so that's how you broaden the base. You bring fresh food back in.
Well, there's no plans whatsoever, Chris, no matter how hard you try to get me to say it, to change at all the GST, and Tony Abbott stated that publicly, and that's the Coalition's policy.
OK, Matt, there is a shrinking GST base. People are spending less, and the states are therefore getting less money from the GST. Surely broadening the base is the first reform that should be discussed by your government right now.
Well, Labor won't be increasing the GST, and we won't be broadening the base. We won't be including food or education. And I think people are starting to question the GST because government revenues are down, and that's a direct relation to the fact that many world economies are still recovering from the global financial crisis. But our economy is better positioned than most others. Low unemployment, low inflation, growth around trend. And we've been undertaking a process of tax reform. But our tax reform...
If you're serious about reform, how can you quarantine the GST from it? It's such a large and important tax.
Because our tax reform has been aimed at providing relief for households and small businesses. And you see that in our policies. We've tripled the tax-free threshold so that, low-paid workers have an incentive to go into and stay in the workforce. We provided relief for small businesses through the instant asset write-off. We tried to get company tax reform through the Parliament, but it was opposed by the Liberal Party and the Greens. We're in a much better position than the Coalition because we do have revenue from the carbon price and the minerals resource rent tax, and that means that they're going to be in a position where they're going to have to cut services come the next election. OK, I'm going to make your day now, Matt Thistlethwaite, because here on Saturday Agenda we've often reviewed the polls, and we've reviewed some pretty bad polls for the Labor Party during the year, so we better go back to earlier in the week and the news poll this week, which seems to have changed the dynamic, according to a lot of people, that is. We see a primary vote here where the Labor Party has picked up to 36%, up 3 points, and the LNP, the Coalition, surprisingly dropped a whole 4 points, which is a significant drop, down to 41%. This translates into a 50-50 two-party preferred vote, basically saying that we'd get the same result if we had an election now as we did in 2010. And on preferred Prime Minister, Julia Gillard has stretched ahead. Matt Thistlethwaite, does this give you a lot of confidence? Is Julia Gillard finally back? Are Labor in the hunt? I don't place too much stock in the polls, Chris, funnily enough, because when I'm out talking to people in New South Wales, they don't really raise it with me. They're more interested in education and health policy and issues like that. But I do think what we're starting to see is that the Australian people can see the plan that Labor has for our economy and our society. And part of that was enunciated this week with the release of the Asian Century White Paper, where we've got a plan for the direction of our economy and our integration within Asia and the benefits that will flow from that. I think people are starting to see Labor's plan for our nation and our economy. Josh Frydenberg, a lot of commentary that Tony Abbott's too negative, that people are sick of his carbon tax message and he needs to change tack.
Well, Tony Abbott's doing a great job, and he has the full support of the party room. I think this poll is a reminder of just how close the next election will be, and we've always thought that would be the case. But it's also a reminder that this is going to be an election between two stark contrasts, between a government that cannot manage the economy, that's seen cost of living dramatically rise, that's seen the imposition of the carbon tax, which is hurting small businesses and families, which engages in a class warfare struggle, trying to make enemies between one Australian and another with its attacks on Gina Rinehart and Twiggy Forrest and others. And when Matt raises the white paper, I mean, that's a great example of looking at not looking at what Labor actually says, but looking at what actually Labor does. Because in that white paper they talked about creating Australia as a low-cost business environment. Well, we've seen 20 new taxes, we've seen 21,000 new regulations since this government has come into office. They talk about putting Australian universities in the top 10 and the top 100 of the world. Well, hang on, just a few days before with the MyEFO budget, they cut education funding by $4 billion. And we know also that they've cut defence spending by more than $5 billion just in the last year alone. So, look at Labor does, not look at Labor says.
Now, we were going to talk about defence spending and border protection. We covered both those issues really with Mike Kelly in the first part of the program. Sure. So I want to skip ahead to another issue that has raised its head this week, perhaps related to the narrowing in the polls. But we've finally seen the opposition take up the AWU, or Slater and Gordon issue, in the Parliament this week with a series of forensic questions from Deputy Opposition Leader Julie Bishop. Here's some of what transpired in Parliament.
To this cheque for over $67,000 from the AWU Workplace Reform Association made out to Slater and Gordon trust account, funds used to purchase that property. As the lawyer advising on the conveyance, does the Prime Minister stand by her statement that she didn't know the money came from the union slush fund that she had assisted in establishing?
I have dealt with these matters on the public record extensively, and no amount of bellowing by those who sit opposite changes that in any way. All this is a cover-up for the fact that they don't have and will never have a plan for the nation's future.
So some very interesting questions there, but Matt, no answers. How long can Julia Gillard continue the strategy of just turning the attack back on refusing to answer these quite forensic questions?
Well, I think as the Prime Minister said there in that clip, she'd made some comments about these issues months ago, and she said yesterday she welcomes any investigation by anybody into these matters. They're welcome to have a look at this issue. But the more salient point, Chris, is the fact that wherever I've been travelling throughout New South Wales, and last week I was in Mungindi, I was in Orange, I was in Moree, and not one person has raised this issue with me ever. They're more interested in policy, and that's what we should be talking about here, frankly, and that's what we devote our time to in the Parliament.
I think there's certainly some truth in that, Matt. Josh Frydenberg, does the opposition risk antagonising the public by focusing on an issue like this rather than the mainstream concerns such as cost of living issues?
Absolutely not. Look, the Prime Minister is rattled. You could see by her body language in Parliament. She doesn't want to answer questions on the floor of the Parliament because she knows she'll end up misleading the House. Look, there are real questions to be answered here about the slush fund, and Julie Bishop has done a fantastic job. She's not a misogynist, I can remind your viewers of that, and she's asking the Prime Minister questions, legitimate questions about what transpired with her time at Slater and Gordon. And what's interesting, Chris, is in the papers today you've got unnamed Labor members of the caucus coming out and saying the Prime Minister needs to do more to dispel the arguments that are being made against her in relation to this. So I think a lot of the Labor Party members are actually worried now about the poor performance of Julia Gillard under the pressure of the Parliament in answering these questions.
Thanks very much for joining us today, Josh Frydenberg in Melbourne. Appreciate your input. We might have you back on the program another time. Matt Thistlethwaite.
Love to.
These questions will continue, but you think that issue's in the past?
Let's stick to policy, mate. That's where the people want us to be.
All right. Thanks again for joining us, Matt Thistlethwaite. So stick